Elizabeth received this flattering stranger with the most splendid hospitality and appointed her favorite Leicester to show him all that was worth seeing in England. He visited all the curiosities of London and Westminster, and from thence proceeded to Oxford and Cambridge, that he might converse with some of the great scholars whose writings shed lustre upon the land of their birth. He was very much disappointed at not finding Dr. Dee among them, and told the Earl of Leicester that he would not have gone to Oxford if he had known that Dee was not there. The Earl promised to introduce him to the great alchemist on their return to London, and the Pole was satisfied. A few days afterwards, the Earl and Lasky being in the antechamber of the Queen, awaiting an audience of Her Majesty, Dr. Dee arrived on the same errand, and was introduced to the Pole. An interesting conversation ensued, which ended by the stranger inviting himself to dine with the astrologer at his house at Mortlake. Dee returned home in some tribulation, for he found he had not money enough, without pawning his plate, to entertain Count Lasky and his retinue in a manner becoming their dignity. In this emergency, he sent off an express to the Earl of Leicester, stating frankly the embarrassment he labored under, and praying his good offices in representing the matter to Her Majesty. Elizabeth immediately sent him a present of £20. On the appointed day, Count Lasky came, attended by a numerous retinue, and expressed such open and warm admiration of the wonderful attainments of his host, that Dee turned over in his own mind how he could bind irretrievably to his interests a man who seemed so well inclined to become his friend. Long acquaintance with Kelly had imbued him with all the roguery of that personage, and he resolved to make the Pole pay dearly for his dinner. He found out before many days that he possessed great estates in his own country, as well as great influence, but that an extravagant disposition had reduced him to temporary embarrassment. He also discovered that he was a firm believer in the philosopher's stone and the water of life. He was therefore just the man upon whom an adventurer might fasten himself. Kelly thought so too, and both of them set to work to weave a web, in the meshes of which they might firmly entangle the rich and credulous stranger. They went very cautiously about it, first throwing out obscure hints of the stone and the elixir, and finally of the spirits by means of whom they could turn over the pages of the Book of Futurity and read the awful secrets inscribed therein. Lasky eagerly implored that he might be admitted to one of their mysterious interviews with Uriel and the angels. But they knew human nature too well to accede at once to the request. To the Count's entreaties, they only replied by hints of the difficulty or impropriety of summoning the spirits in the presence of a stranger, or of one who might perchance have no other motive than the gratification of a vain curiosity. But they only meant to whet the edge of his appetite by this delay, and would have been sorry indeed if the Count had been discouraged. To show how exclusively the thoughts both of Dee and Kelly were fixed upon their dupe at this time, it is only necessary to read the introduction to their first interview with the spirits, related in the volume of Dr. Casaubon. The entry made by Dee under the date of the 25th of May, 1583, says that when the spirit appeared to them, I and E.K. sat together, conversing of that noble Polonian Albertus Lasky, his great honor here with us obtained, and of his great liking among all sorts of the people. No doubt they were discussing how they might make the most of the noble Polonian, and concocting the fine story with which they afterwards excited his curiosity, and drew him firmly within their toils. Suddenly, says Dee, as they were thus employed, there seemed to come out of the oratory a spiritual creature, like a pretty girl of 7 or 9 years of age, attired on her head, with her hair rolled up before and hanging down behind, with a gown of silk, of changeable red and green, and with a train. She seemed to play up and down, and seemed to go in and out behind the books. And as she seemed to go between them, the books displaced themselves and made way for her. With such tales as these they lured on the Pole from day to day, and at last persuaded him to be a witness of their mysteries. Whether they played off any optical delusions upon him, or whether by the force of a strong imagination he deluded himself, does not appear, but certain it is that he became a complete tool in their hands, and consented to do whatever they wished him. Kelly at these interviews placed himself at a certain distance from the wondrous crystal, and gazed intently upon it, while Dee took his place in a corner, ready to set down the prophecies as they were uttered by the spirits. In this manner they prophesied to the Pole that he should become the fortunate possessor of the philosopher's stone, that he should live for centuries, and be chosen king of Poland, in which capacity he should gain many great victories over the Saracens, and make his name illustrious over all the earth. For this purpose it was necessary, however, that Lasky should leave England and take them with him, together with their wives and families, that he should treat them all sumptuously and allow them to want for nothing. Lasky at once consented, and very shortly afterwards they were all on the road to Poland. It took them upwards of 4 months to reach the Count's estates in the neighborhood of Krakow. In the meantime, they led a pleasant life and spent money with an unsparing hand. When once established in the Count's palace, they commenced the great hermetic operation of transmuting iron into gold. Lasky provided them with all necessary materials and aided them himself with his knowledge of alchemy. But somehow or other, the experiment always failed at the very moment it ought to have succeeded, and they were obliged to recommence operations on a grander scale. But the hopes of Lasky were not easily extinguished. Already an idea the possessor of countless millions, he was not to be cast down for fear of present expenses. He thus continued from day to day and from month to month, till he was at last obliged to sell a portion of his deeply mortgaged estates to find aliment for the hungry crucibles of Dee and Kelly, and the no less hungry stomachs of their wives and families. It was not till ruin stared him in the face that he awoke from his dream of infatuation, too happy even then to find that he had escaped utter beggary. Thus restored to his senses, his first thought was how to rid himself of his expensive visitors. Not wishing to quarrel with them, he proposed that they should proceed to Prague, well furnished with letters of recommendation to the Emperor Rudolph. Our alchemist, too, plainly saw that nothing more was to be made of the almost destitute Count Lasky. Without hesitation, therefore, they accepted the proposal and set out forthwith to the imperial residence. They had no difficulty on their arrival at Prague in obtaining an audience of the emperor. They found him willing enough to believe that such a thing as the philosopher's stone existed, and flattered themselves that they had made a favorable impression upon him. But from some cause or other, perhaps the look of low cunning and quackery upon the face of Kelly, the emperor conceived no very high opinion of their abilities. He allowed them, however, to remain for some months at Prague, feeding themselves upon the hope that he would employ them. But the more he saw of them, the less he liked them. And when the Pope's nuncio represented to him that he ought not to countenance such heretic magicians, he gave orders that they should quit his dominions within 24 hours. It was fortunate for them that so little time was given them, for had they remained 6 hours longer, the nuncio had received orders to procure a perpetual dungeon or the stake for them. Not knowing well whither to direct their steps, they resolved to return to Krakow, where they had still a few friends. But by this time the funds they had drawn from Lasky were almost exhausted, and they were many days obliged to go dinnerless and supperless. They had great difficulty to keep their poverty a secret from the world, but they managed to bear privation without murmuring, from a conviction that if the fact were known, it would militate very much against their pretensions. Nobody would believe that they were possessors of the philosopher's stone, if it were once suspected that they did not know how to procure bread for their subsistence. They still gained a little by casting nativities, and kept starvation at arm's length, till a new dupe, rich enough for their purposes, dropped into their toils in the shape of a royal personage. Having procured an introduction to Stephen, King of Poland, they predicted to him that the Emperor Rudolph would shortly be assassinated, and that the Germans would look to Poland for his successor. As this prediction was not precise enough to satisfy the king, they tried their crystal again, and a spirit appeared who told them that the new sovereign of Germany would be Stephen of Poland. Stephen was credulous enough to believe them and was once present when Kelly held his mystic conversations with the shadows of his crystal. He also appears to have furnished them with money to carry on their experiments in alchemy, but he grew tired at last of their broken promises and their constant drains upon his pocket, and was on the point of discarding them with disgrace when they met with another dupe, to whom they eagerly transferred their services. This was Count Rosenberg, a nobleman of large estates at Trebona in Bohemia. So comfortable did they find themselves in the palace of this munificent patron, that they remained nearly 4 years with him, faring sumptuously, and having an almost unlimited command of his money. The Count was more ambitious than avaricious. He had wealth enough and did not care for the philosopher's stone on account of the gold, but of the length of days it would bring him. They had their predictions, accordingly, all ready framed to suit his character. They prophesied that he should be chosen King of Poland, and promised moreover that he should live for 500 years to enjoy his dignity, provided always that he found them sufficient money to carry on their experiments. But now, while fortune smiled upon them, while they reveled in the rewards of successful villainy, retributive justice came upon them in a shape they had not anticipated. Jealousy and mistrust sprang up between the two confederates, and led to such violent and frequent quarrels that Dee was in constant fear of exposure. Kelly imagined himself a much greater personage than Dee, measuring most likely by the standard of impudent roguery, and was displeased that on all occasions and from all persons, Dee received the greater share of honor and consideration. He often threatened to leave Dee to shift for himself, and the latter, who had degenerated into the mere tool of his more daring associate, was distressed beyond measure at the prospect of his desertion. His mind was so deeply imbued with superstition that he believed the rhapsodies of Kelly to be, in a great measure, derived from his intercourse with angels, and he knew not where in the whole world to look for a man of depth and wisdom enough to succeed him. As their quarrels every day became more and more frequent, Dee wrote letters to Queen Elizabeth to secure a favorable reception on his return to England, whither he intended to proceed if Kelly forsook him. He also sent her a round piece of silver which he pretended he had made of a portion of brass cut out of a warming pan. He afterwards sent her the warming pan also, that she might convince herself that the piece of silver corresponded exactly with the hole which was cut into the brass. While thus preparing for the worst, his chief desire was to remain in Bohemia with Count Rosenberg, who treated him well and reposed much confidence in him. Neither had Kelly any great objection to remain, but a new passion had taken possession of his breast, and he was laying deep schemes to gratify it. His own wife was ill-favored and ill-natured, Dee's was comely and agreeable, and he longed to make an exchange of partners without exciting the jealousy or shocking the morality of Dee. This was a difficult matter, but to a man like Kelly, who was as deficient in rectitude and right feeling as he was full of impudence and ingenuity, the difficulty was not insurmountable. He had also deeply studied the character and the foibles of Dee, and he took his measures accordingly. The next time they consulted the spirits, Kelly pretended to be shocked at their language and refused to tell Dee what they had said. Dee insisted and was informed that they were henceforth to have their wives in common. Dee, a little startled, inquired whether the spirits might not mean that they were to live in common harmony and goodwill. Kelly tried again, with apparent reluctance, and said the spirits insisted upon the literal interpretation. The poor fanatic Dee resigned himself to their will, but it suited Kelly's purpose to appear coy a little longer. He declared that the spirits must be spirits not of good, but of evil, and refused to consult them any more. He thereupon took his departure, saying that he would never return. Dee, thus left to himself, was in sore trouble and distress of mind. He knew not on whom to fix as the successor to Kelly for consulting the spirits, but at last chose his son Arthur, a boy of 8 years of age. He consecrated him to this service with great ceremony, and impressed upon the child's mind the dignified and awful nature of the duties he was called upon to perform. But the poor boy had neither the imagination, the faith, nor the artifice of Kelly. He looked intently upon the crystal as he was told, but could see nothing and hear nothing. At last, when his eyes ached, he said he could see a vague, indistinct shadow, but nothing more. Dee was in despair. The deception had been carried on so long that he was never so happy as when he fancied he was holding converse with superior beings, and he cursed the day that had put estrangement between him and his dear friend Kelly. This was exactly what Kelly had foreseen, and when he thought the doctor had grieved sufficiently for his absence, he returned unexpectedly and entered the room where the little Arthur was in vain endeavoring to distinguish something in the crystal. Dee, in entering this circumstance in his journal, ascribes this sudden return to a miraculous fortune and a divine fate, and goes on to record that Kelly immediately saw the spirits which had remained invisible to little Arthur. One of these spirits reiterated the previous command, that they should have their wives in common. Kelly bowed his head and submitted, and Dee, in all humility, consented to the arrangement. This was the extreme depth of the wretched man's degradation. In this manner they continued to live for 3 or 4 months, when, new quarrels breaking out, they separated once more. This time their separation was final. Kelly, taking the elixir which he had found in Glastonbury Abbey, proceeded to Prague, forgetful of the abrupt mode in which he had previously been expelled from that city. Almost immediately after his arrival, he was seized by order of the Emperor Rudolph and thrown into prison. He was released after some months' confinement, and continued for 5 years to lead a vagabond life in Germany, telling fortunes at one place and pretending to make gold at another. He was a second time thrown into prison on a charge of heresy and sorcery, and he then resolved, if ever he obtained his liberty, to return to England. He soon discovered that there was no prospect of this, and that his imprisonment was likely to be for life. He twisted his bedclothes into a rope, one stormy night in February 1595, and let himself down from the window of his dungeon, situated at the top of a very high tower. Being a corpulent man, the rope gave way and he was precipitated to the ground. He broke two of his ribs and both his legs and was otherwise so much injured that he expired a few days afterwards. Dee, for a while, had more prosperous fortune. The warming pan he had sent to Queen Elizabeth was not without effect. He was rewarded soon after Kelly had left him with an invitation to return to England. His pride, which had been sorely humbled, sprang up again to its pristine dimensions, and he set out from Bohemia with a train of attendants, becoming an ambassador. How he procured the money does not appear, unless from the liberality of the rich Bohemian Rosenberg, or perhaps from his plunder. He traveled with 3 coaches for himself and family and 3 wagons to carry his baggage. Each coach had 4 horses, and the whole train was protected by a guard of 24 soldiers. This statement may be doubted, but it is on the authority of Dee himself, who made it on oath before the commissioners appointed by Elizabeth to inquire into his circumstances. On his arrival in England, he had an audience of the Queen, who received him kindly as far as words went, and gave orders that he should not be molested in his pursuits of chemistry and philosophy. A man who boasted of the power to turn baser metals into gold could not, thought Elizabeth, be in want of money, and she therefore gave him no more substantial marks of her approbation than her countenance and protection. Thrown thus unexpectedly upon his own resources, Dee began in earnest the search for the philosopher's stone. He worked incessantly among his furnaces, retorts, and crucibles, and almost poisoned himself with deleterious fumes. He also consulted his miraculous crystal, but the spirits appeared not to him. He tried one Bartholomew to supply the place of the invaluable Kelly, but he being a man of some little probity and of no imagination at all, the spirits would not hold any communication with him. Dee then tried another pretender to philosophy of the name of Hickman, but had no better fortune. The crystal had lost its power since the departure of its great high priest. From this quarter, then, Dee could get no information on the stone or elixir of the alchemists, and all his efforts to discover them by other means were not only fruitless but expensive. He was soon reduced to great distress, and wrote piteous letters to the Queen praying relief. He represented that, after he left England with Count Lasky, the mob had pillaged his house at Mortlake, accusing him of being a necromancer and a wizard, and had broken all his furniture, burned his library, consisting of 4,000 rare volumes, and destroyed all the philosophical instruments and curiosities in his museum. For this damage he claimed compensation, and furthermore stated that as he had come to England by the Queen's command, she ought to pay the expenses of his journey. Elizabeth sent him small sums of money at various times, but Dee still continuing his complaints, a commission was appointed to inquire into his circumstances. He finally obtained a small appointment as Chancellor of St. Paul's Cathedral, which he exchanged in 1595 for the wardenship of the college at Manchester. He remained in this capacity till 1602 or 1603, when, his strength and intellect beginning to fail him, he was compelled to resign. He retired to his old dwelling at Mortlake in a state not far removed from actual want, supporting himself as a common fortune-teller, and being often obliged to sell or pawn his books to procure a dinner. James III was often applied to on his behalf, but he refused to do anything for him. It may be said to the discredit of this king that the only reward he would grant the indefatigable Stowe, in his days of old age and want, was the royal permission to beg. But no one will blame him for neglecting such a quack as John Dee. He died in 1608 in the 81st year of his age and was buried at Mortlake. Many disputes have arisen as to the real name of the alchemist who wrote several works under the above designation. The general opinion is that he was a Scotsman named Seton, and that by a fate very common to alchemists who boasted too loudly of their powers of transmutation, he ended his days miserably in a dungeon, into which he was thrown by a German potentate until he made 1,000,000 of gold to pay his ransom. By some he has been confounded with Michael Sendivog, or Sendivogius, a Pole, a professor of the same art, who made a great noise in Europe at the commencement of the 17th century. Lenglet du Fresnoy, who is in general well informed with respect to the alchemists, inclines to the belief that these personages were distinct, and gives the following particulars of the cosmopolite, extracted from George Morhoff in his Epistola ad Langerlotum and other writers. About the year 1600, one Jacob Howson, a Dutch pilot, was shipwrecked on the coast of Scotland. A gentleman named Alexander Seton put off in a boat and saved him from drowning, and afterwards entertained him hospitably for many weeks at his house on the shore. Howson saw that he was addicted to the pursuits of chemistry, but no conversation on the subject passed between them at the time. About a year and a half afterwards, Housen, being then at home at Inquisition in Holland, received a visit from his former host. He endeavored to repay the kindness that had been shown him, and so great a friendship arose between them that Seton, on his departure, offered to make him acquainted with the great secret of the Philosopher's Stone. In his presence, the Scotsman transmuted a great quantity of base metal into pure gold, and gave it him as a mark of his esteem. Seton then took leave of his friend and traveled into Germany. At Dresden, he made no secret of his wonderful powers, having, it is said, performed transmutations successfully before a great assemblage of the learned men of that city. The circumstance coming to the ears of the Duke or Elector of Saxony, he gave orders for the arrest of the alchemist. He caused him to be imprisoned in a high tower, and set a guard of 40 men to watch that he did not escape, and that no strangers were admitted to his presence. The unfortunate Seton received several visits from the Elector, who used every art of persuasion to make him divulge his secret. Seton obstinately refused either to communicate his secret or to make any gold for the tyrant, on which he was stretched upon the rack to see if the argument of torture would render him more tractable. The result was still the same. Neither hope of reward nor fear of anguish could shake him. For several months he remained in prison, subjected alternately to a sedative and a violent regimen, till his health broke, and he wasted away almost to a skeleton. There happened at that time to be in Dresden a learned Pole named Michael Sendivogius, who had wasted a good deal of his time and substance in the unprofitable pursuits of alchemy. He was touched with pity for the hard fate and admiration for the intrepidity of Seton, and determined, if possible, to aid him in escaping from the clutch of his oppressor. He requested the Elector's permission to see the alchemist, and obtained it with some difficulty. He found him in a state of great wretchedness, shut up from the light of day in a noisome dungeon, and with no better couch or fare than those allotted to the worst of criminals. Seton listened eagerly to the proposal of escape, and promised the generous Pole that he would make him richer than an Eastern monarch if by his means he were liberated. Sendivogius immediately commenced operations. He sold some property which he possessed near Krakow, and with the proceeds led a merry life at Dresden. He gave the most elegant suppers, to which he regularly invited the officers of the guard, and especially those who did duty at the prison of the alchemist. He insinuated himself at last into their confidence, and obtained free ingress to his friend as often as he pleased, pretending that he was using his utmost endeavors to conquer his obstinacy and worm his secret out of him. When their project was ripe, a day was fixed upon for the grand attempt, and Sendivogius was ready with a post-chariot to convey him with all speed into Poland. By drugging some wine which he presented to the guards of the prison, he rendered them so drowsy that he easily found means to scale a wall unobserved with Seton and effect his escape. Seton's wife was in the chariot awaiting him, having safely in her possession a small packet of a black powder, which was in fact the Philosopher's Stone, or ingredient for the transmutation of iron and copper into gold. They all arrived in safety at Krakow, but the frame of Seton was so wasted by torture of body and starvation, to say nothing of the anguish of mind he had endured, that he did not long survive. He died in Krakow in 1603 or 1604, and was buried under the cathedral church of that city. Such is the story related of the author of the various works which bear the name of the Cosmopolite. A list of them may be found in the 3rd volume of the History of the Hermetic Philosophy. On the death of Seton, Sendivogius married his widow, hoping to learn from her some of the secrets of her deceased lord in the art of transmutation. The ounce of black powder stood him, however, in better service, for the alchemists say that by its means he converted great quantities of quicksilver into the purest gold. Monsieur Desnoyers, secretary to the Princess Mary of Gonzaga, Queen of Poland, writing from Warsaw in 1651, says that he saw this tablet which existed at that time, and was often visited by the curious. The afterlife of Sendivogius is related in a Latin memoir of him by one Brodowski, his steward, and is inserted by Pierre Borel in his Treasure of Gaulish Antiquities. The Emperor Rudolph, according to this authority, was so well pleased with his success that he made him one of his counselors of state, and invited him to fill a station in the royal household and inhabit the palace. But Sendivogius loved his liberty, and refused to become a courtier. He preferred to reside on his own patrimonial estate of Gravarna, where, for many years, he exercised a princely hospitality. His philosophic powder, which his steward says was red and not black, he kept in a little box of gold, and with 1 grain of it he could make 500 ducats, or 1,000 rix dollars. He generally made his projection upon quicksilver. When he traveled, he gave this box to his steward, who hung it round his neck by a gold chain next his skin. But the greatest part of the powder he used to hide in a secret place, cut into the step of his chariot. He thought that if attacked at any time by robbers, they would not search such a place as that. When he anticipated any danger, he would dress himself in his valet's clothes and, mounting the coach box, put the valet inside. He was induced to take these precautions because it was no secret that he possessed the Philosopher's Stone, and many unprincipled adventurers were on the watch for an opportunity to plunder him. A German prince, whose name Brodowski has not thought fit to chronicle, served him a scurvy trick, which ever afterwards put him on his guard. This prince went on his knees to Sendivogius and entreated him in the most pressing terms to satisfy his curiosity by converting some quicksilver into gold before him. Sendivogius, wearied by his importunity, consented upon a promise of inviolable secrecy. After his departure, the prince called a German alchemist named Mühlenfels, who resided in his house, and told him all that had been done. Mühlenfels entreated that he might have a dozen mounted horsemen at his command, that he might instantly ride after the philosopher, and either rob him of all his powder or force from him the secret of making it. The prince desired nothing better. Mühlenfels, being provided with 12 men well mounted and armed, pursued Sendivogius in hot haste. He came up with him at a lonely inn by the roadside, just as he was sitting down to dinner. He at first endeavored to persuade him to divulge the secret, but finding this of no avail, he caused his accomplices to strip the unfortunate Sendivogius and tie him naked to one of the pillars of the house. He then took from him his golden box, containing a small quantity of the powder, a manuscript book on the Philosopher's Stone, a golden medal with its chain, presented to him by the Emperor Rudolph, and a rich cap, ornamented with diamonds, of the value of 100,000 rixdollars. With this booty he decamped, leaving Sendivogius still naked and firmly bound to the pillar. His servants had been treated in a similar manner, but the people of the inn released them all as soon as the robbers were out of sight. Sendivogius proceeded to Prague and made his complaint to the emperor. An express was instantly sent off to the prince, with orders that he should deliver up Mühlenfels and all his plunder. The prince, fearful of the emperor's wrath, caused 3 large gallows to be erected in his courtyard, on the highest of which he hanged Mühlenfels, with another thief on each side of him. He thus propitiated the emperor and got rid of an ugly witness against himself. He sent back at the same time the bejeweled hat, the medal and chain, and the treatise upon the Philosopher's Stone, which had been stolen from Sendivogius. As regarded the powder, he said he had not seen it and knew nothing about it. This adventure made Sendivogius more prudent. He would no longer perform the process of transmutation before any strangers, however highly recommended. He pretended also to be very poor, and sometimes lay in bed for weeks together, that people might believe he was suffering from some dangerous malady, and could not therefore, by any possibility, be the owner of the Philosopher's Stone. He would occasionally coin false money and pass it off as gold, preferring to be esteemed a cheat rather than a successful alchemist. Many other extraordinary tales are told of this personage by his steward Brodowski, but they are not worth repeating. He died in 1636, aged upwards of 80, and was buried in his own chapel at Gravarna. Several works upon alchemy have been published under his name. It was during the time of the last mentioned author that the sect of the Rosicrucians first began to create a sensation in Europe. The influence which they exercised upon opinion during their brief career and the permanent impression which they have left upon European literature claim for them a special notice. Before their time, alchemy was but a groveling delusion, and theirs is the merit of having spiritualized and refined it. They also enlarged its sphere and supposed the possession of the Philosopher's Stone to be not only the means of wealth, but of health and happiness, and the instrument by which man could command the services of superior beings, control the elements to his will, defy the obstructions of time and space, and acquire the most intimate knowledge of all the secrets of the universe. Wild and visionary as they were not without their uses. If it were only for having purged the superstitions of Europe of the dark and disgusting forms with which the monks had peopled it, and substituted in their stead a race of mild, graceful, and beneficent beings. They are said to have derived their name from Christian Rosenkreuz or Rosecross, a German philosopher who traveled in the Holy Land towards the close of the 14th century. While dangerously ill at a place called Damkar, he was visited by some learned Arabs who claimed him as their brother in science, and unfolded to him, by inspiration, all the secrets of his past life, both of thought and of action. They restored him to health by means of the Philosopher's Stone, and afterwards instructed him in all their mysteries. He returned to Europe in 1401, being then only 23 years of age, and drew a chosen number of his friends around him, whom he initiated into the new science and bound by solemn oaths to keep it secret for a century. He is said to have lived 83 years after this period, and to have died in 1484. Many have denied the existence of such a personage as Rosicrucians, and have fixed the origin of this sect at a much later epoch. The first dawning of it, they say, is to be found in the theories of Paracelsus and the dreams of Dr. Dee, who, without intending it, became the actual, though never the recognized founders of the Rosicrucian philosophy. It is now difficult and indeed impossible to determine whether Dee and Paracelsus obtained their ideas from the then obscure and unknown Rosicrucians, or whether the Rosicrucians did but follow and improve upon them. Certain it is that their existence was never suspected till the year 1605, when they began to excite attention in Germany. No sooner were their doctrines promulgated than all the visionaries, Paracelsus, and alchemists flocked around their standard and vaunted Rosenkreutz as the new regenerator of the human race. Michael Mayer, a celebrated physician of that day, and who had impaired his health and wasted his fortune in searching for the philosopher's stone, drew up a report of the tenets and ordinances of the new fraternity, which was published at Cologne in the year 1615. They asserted in the first place that the meditations of their founders surpassed everything that had ever been imagined since the creation of the world, without even accepting the revelations of the deity, that they were destined to accomplish the general peace and regeneration of man before the end of the world arrived, that they possessed all wisdom and piety in a supreme degree, that they possessed all the graces of nature and could distribute them among the rest of mankind according to their pleasure, that they were subject to neither hunger, nor thirst, nor disease, nor old age, nor to any other inconvenience of nature, that they knew by inspiration, and at the first glance, everyone who was worthy to be admitted into their society, that they had the same knowledge then which they would have possessed if they had lived from the beginning of the world, and had been always acquiring it, that they had a volume in which they could read all that ever was or ever would be written in other books till the end of time, that they could force to and retain in their service the most powerful spirits and demons, that, by the virtue of their songs, they could attract pearls and precious stones from the depths of the sea or the bowels of the earth, that God had covered them with a thick cloud, by means of which they could shelter themselves from the malignity of their enemies, and that they could thus render themselves invisible from all eyes, that the first 8 brethren of the Rose Cross had power to cure all maladies, that, by means of the fraternity, the triple diadem of the Pope would be reduced into dust, that they only admitted 2 sacraments, with the ceremonies of the primitive church, renewed by them, that they recognized the 4th monarchy and the Emperor of the Romans as their chief and the chief of all Christians, that they would provide him with more gold, their treasures being inexhaustible than the King of Spain had ever drawn from the golden regions of eastern and western India. This was their confession of faith. Their rules of conduct were 6 in number, and as follow. First, that in their travels they should gratuitously cure all diseases. Secondly, that they should always dress in conformity to the fashion of the country in which they resided. Thirdly, that they should once every year meet together in the place appointed by the fraternity, or send in writing an available excuse. Fourthly, that every brother, whenever he felt inclined to die, should choose a person worthy to succeed him. Fifthly, that the words Rosecross should be the marks by which they should recognize each other. Sixthly, that their fraternity should be kept secret for 6 times 20 years. They asserted that these laws had been found inscribed in a golden book in the tomb of Rosenkreutz, and that the 6 times 20 years from his death expired in 1604. They were consequently called upon from that time forth to promulgate their doctrine for the welfare of mankind. For 8 years these enthusiasts made converts in Germany, but they excited little or no attention in other parts of Europe. At last they made their appearance in Paris, and threw all the learned, all the credulous, and all the lovers of the marvelous into commotion. In the beginning of March 1623, the good folks of that city, when they arose one morning, were surprised to find all their walls placarded with the following singular manifesto: "We, the deputies of the principal college of the Brethren of the Rose Cross, have taken up our abode, visible and invisible in this city, by the grace of the Most High, towards whom are turned the hearts of the just. We show and teach without books or signs, and speak all sorts of languages in the countries where we dwell, to draw mankind, our fellows, from error and from death." For a long time this strange placard was the sole topic of conversation in all public places. Some few wondered, but the greater number only laughed at it. In the course of a few weeks, 2 books were published, which raised the first alarm respecting this mysterious society, whose dwelling place no one knew, and no members of which had ever been seen. The first was called A History of the Frightful Compacts Entered into Between the Devil and the Pretended Invisibles, with their damnable instructions, the deplorable ruin of their disciples, and their miserable end. The other was called An Examination of the New and Unknown Kabbalah of the Brethren of the Rose Cross, who have lately inhabited the city of Paris, with the history of their manners, the wonders worked by them, and many other particulars. These books sold rapidly. Everyone was anxious to know something of this dreadful and secret brotherhood. The Badauds of Paris were so alarmed that they daily expected to see the arch-enemy walking in propria persona among them. It was said in these volumes that the Rosicrucian society consisted of 36 persons in all, who had renounced their baptism in hope of resurrection. That it was not by means of good angels, as they pretended, that they worked their prodigies, but that it was the devil who gave them power to transport themselves from one end of the world to the other with the rapidity of thought, to speak all languages, to have their purses always full of money, however much they might spend, to be invisible and penetrate into the most secret places in spite of fastenings of bolts and bars, and to be able to tell the past and future. These 36 brethren were divided into bands or companies. 6 of them only had been sent on the mission to Paris, 6 to Italy, 6 to Spain, 6 to Germany, 4 to Sweden, and 2 into Switzerland, 2 into Flanders, 2 into Lorraine, and 2 into Franche-Comté. It was generally believed that the missionaries to France resided somewhere in the Marais du Temple. That quarter of Paris soon acquired a bad name, and people were afraid to take houses in it, lest they should be turned out by the 6 invisibles of the Rose Cross. It was believed by the populace, and by many others whose education should have taught them better, that persons of a mysterious aspect used to visit the inns and hotels of Paris, and eat of the best meats and drink of the best wines, and then suddenly melt away into thin air when the landlord came with the reckoning. That gentle maidens who went to bed alone often awoke in the night and found men in bed with them, of shape more beautiful than the Grecian Apollo, who immediately became invisible when an alarm was raised. It was also said that many persons found large heaps of gold in their houses without knowing from whence they came. All Paris was in alarm. No man thought himself secure of his goods, no maiden of her virginity, or wife of her chastity, while these Rosicrucians were abroad. In the midst of the commotion, a second placard was issued to the following effect: If anyone desires to see the brethren of the Rose Cross from curiosity only, he will never communicate with us. But if his will really induces him to inscribe his name in the register of our brotherhood, we, who can judge of the thoughts of all men, will convince him of the truth of our promises. For this reason we do not publish to the world the place of our abode. Thought alone in unison with the sincere will of those who desire to know us is sufficient to make us known to them, and them to us. Though the existence of such a society as that of the Rose Cross was problematical, it was quite evident that somebody or other was concerned in the promulgation of these placards, which were stuck up on every wall in Paris. The police endeavored in vain to find out the offenders, and their want of success only served to increase the perplexity of the public. The church very soon took up the question, and the Abbé Gautier, a Jesuit, wrote a book to prove that, by their enmity to the Pope, they could be no other than disciples of Luther, sent to promulgate his heresy. Their very name, he added, proved that they were heretics. A cross surmounted by a rose being the heraldic device of the arch-heretic Luther. One Guras said they were a confraternity of drunken impostors, and that their name was derived from the garland of roses in the form of a cross, hung over the tables of taverns in Germany as the emblem of secrecy, and from whence was derived the common saying, when one man communicated a secret to another, that it was said under the rose. Others interpreted the letters FRC to mean not brethren of the Rose Cross, but fratris roris cocti, or brothers of boiled dew, and explained this appellation by alleging that they collected large quantities of morning dew and boiled it in order to extract a very valuable ingredient in the composition of the philosopher's stone and the water of life. The fraternity thus attacked defended themselves as well as they were able. They denied that they used magic of any kind or that they consulted the devil. They said they were all happy, that they had lived more than a century and expected to live many centuries more, and that the intimate knowledge which they possessed of all nature was communicated to them by God himself as a reward for their piety and utter devotion to his service. Those were in error who derived their name from a cross of roses or called them drunkards. To set the world right on the first point, they reiterated that they derived their name from Christian Rosicrucian, their founder. And to answer the latter charge, they repeated that they knew not what thirst was, and had higher pleasures than those of the palate. They did not desire to meddle with the politics or religion of any man or set of men, although they could not help denying the supremacy of the Pope, and looking upon him as a tyrant. Many slanders, they said, had been repeated respecting them, the most unjust of which was that they indulged in carnal appetites, and, under the cloak of their invisibility, crept into the chambers of beautiful maidens. They asserted, on the contrary, that the first vow they took on entering the society was a vow of chastity, and that anyone among them who transgressed in that particular would immediately lose all the advantages he enjoyed and be exposed once more to hunger, woe, disease, and death like other men. So strongly did they feel on the subject of chastity that they attributed the fall of Adam solely to his want of this virtue. Besides defending themselves in this manner, they entered into a further confession of their faith. They discarded forever all the old tales of sorcery and witchcraft and communion with the devil. They said there were no such horrid, unnatural, and disgusting beings as the incubi and succubi, and the innumerable grotesque imps that men had believed in for so many ages. Man was not surrounded with enemies like these, but with myriads of beautiful and beneficent beings, all anxious to do him service. The air was peopled with sylphs, the water with undines or naiads, the bowels of the earth with gnomes, and the fire with salamanders. All these beings were the friends of man and desired nothing so much as that men should purge themselves of all uncleanness, and thus be enabled to see and converse with them. They possessed great power, and were unrestrained by the barriers of space or the obstructions of matter. But man was in one particular their superior. He had an immortal soul, and they had not. They might, however, become sharers in man's immortality if they could inspire one of that race with the passion of love towards them. Hence it was the constant endeavor of the female spirits to captivate the admiration of men, and of the male gnomes, sylphs, salamanders, and undines to be beloved by a woman. The object of this passion in returning their love imparted a portion of that celestial fire, the soul. And from that time forth the beloved became equal to the lover, and both, when their allotted course was run, entered together into the mansions of felicity. These spirits, they said, watched constantly over mankind by night and day. Dreams, omens, and presentiments were all their works, and the means by which they gave warning of the approach of danger. But though so well inclined to befriend man for their own sakes, the want of a soul rendered them at times capricious and revengeful. They took offense on slight causes and heaped injuries instead of benefits on the heads of those who extinguished the light of reason that was in them by gluttony, debauchery, and other appetites of the body. The excitement produced in Paris by the placards of the Brotherhood and the attacks of the clergy wore itself away after a few months. The stories circulated about them became at last too absurd even for that age of absurdity, and men began to laugh once more at those invisible gentlemen and their fantastic doctrines. Gabriel Naudet at that conjuncture brought out his Avis à la France sur les frères de la Rose-Croix, in which he very successfully exposed the folly of the new sect. This work, though not well written, was well timed. It quite extinguished the Rosicrucians of France, and after that year little more was heard of them. Swindlers in different parts of the country assumed the name at times to cloak their depredations, and now and then one of them was caught and hanged for his too great ingenuity in enticing pearls and precious stones from the pockets of other people into his own, or for passing off lumps of gilded brass for pure gold, made by the agency of the philosopher's stone. With these exceptions, oblivion shrouded them. The doctrine was not confined to a sphere so narrow as France alone. It still nourished in Germany and drew many converts in England. The latter countries produced two great masters in the persons of Jacob Böhmen and Robert Flood, pretended philosophers of whom it is difficult to say which was the more absurd and extravagant. It would appear that the sect was divided into two classes: the brothers Rosicrucians, who devoted themselves to the wonders of this sublunary sphere, and the brothers Auricrucians, who were wholly occupied in the contemplation of things divine. Flood belonged to the first class and Böhmen to the second. Flood may be called the father of the English Rosicrucians, and as such merits a conspicuous niche in the Temple of Folly. He was born in the year 1574 at Millgate in Kent, and was the son of Sir Thomas Flood, Treasurer of War to Queen Elizabeth. He was originally intended for the army, but he was too fond of study, and of a disposition too quiet and retiring, to shine in that sphere. His father would not therefore press him to adopt a course of life for which he was unsuited, and encouraged him in the study of medicine, for which he early manifested a partiality. At the age of 25, he proceeded to the continent, and being fond of the abstruse, the marvelous, and the incomprehensible, he became an ardent disciple of the school of Paracelsus, whom he looked upon as the regenerator not only of medicine but of philosophy. He remained 6 years in Italy, France, and Germany, storing his mind with fantastic notions and seeking the society of enthusiasts and visionaries. On his return to England in 1605, he received the degree of Doctor of Medicine from the University of Oxford and began to practice as a physician in London. He soon made himself conspicuous. He Latinized his name from Robert Flood into Robertus a Fluctibus and began the promulgation of many strange doctrines. He avowed his belief in the philosopher's stone, the water of life, and the universal alkahest, and maintained that there were but two principles of all things, which were condensation, the boreal or northern virtue, and rarefaction, the southern or austral virtue. A number of demons, he said, ruled over the human frame, whom he arranged in their places in a rhomboid. Every disease had its peculiar demon who produced it, which demon could only be combated by the aid of the demon whose place was directly opposite to his in the rhomboidal figure. Of his medical notions we shall have further occasion to speak in another part of this book, when we consider him in his character as one of the first founders of the magnetic delusion, and its offshoot, animal magnetism, which has created so much sensation in our own day. As if the doctrines already mentioned were not wild enough, he joined the Rosicrucians as soon as they began to make a sensation in Europe, and succeeded in raising himself to high consideration among them. The fraternity having been violently attacked by several German authors, and among others by Libavius, Flood volunteered a reply, and published in 1616 his defense of the Rosicrucian philosophy under the title of the Apologia Compendiaria Fraternitatem de Rosea Cruz. This work immediately procured him great renown upon the continent, and he was henceforth looked upon as one of the high priests of the sect. Of so much importance was he considered that Kepler and Gassendi thought it necessary to refute him, and the latter wrote a complete examination of his doctrine. Mersenne also, the friend of Descartes, and who had defended that philosopher when accused of having joined the Rosicrucians, attacked Dr. A. Fluctibus, as he preferred to be called, and showed the absurdity of the Brothers of the Rose-Cross in general, and of Dr. A. Fluctibus in particular. Fluctibus wrote a long reply in which he called Mersenne an ignorant calumniator, and reiterated that alchemy was a profitable science, and the Rosicrucians worthy to be the regenerators of the world. This book was published at Frankfurt and was entitled Summum Bonum. Besides this, he wrote several other works upon alchemy, a second answer to Libavius upon the Rosicrucians, and many medical works. He died in London in 1637. After his time, there was some diminution of the sect in England. They excited but little attention and made no effort to bring themselves into notice. Occasionally some obscure and almost incomprehensible work made its appearance, to show the world that the folly was not extinguished. Eugenius Philalethes, a noted alchemist who has veiled his real name under this assumed one, translated The Fame and Confession of the Brethren of the Rosy Cross, which was published in London in 1652. A few years afterwards, another enthusiast named John Hayden wrote two works on the subject, the one entitled The Wise Man's Crown, or The Glory of the Rosy Cross, and the other, The Holy Guide, leading the way to unite art and nature with the Rosy Cross uncovered. Neither of these attracted much notice. A third book was somewhat more successful. It was called A New Method of Rosicrucian Physic, by John Hayden, the servant of God and the secretary of nature. A few extracts will show the ideas of the English Rosicrucians about this period. Its author was an attorney, practicing, to use his own words, at Westminster Hall all term times as long as he lived, and in the vacations devoting himself to alchemical and Rosicrucian meditation. In his preface, called by him an apologue for an epilogue, he enlightens the public upon the true history and tenets of his sect. Moses, Elias, and Ezekiel were, he says, the most ancient masters of the Rosicrucian philosophy. Those few then existing in England and the rest of Europe were as the eyes and ears of the great King of the universe, seeing and hearing all things, seraphically illuminated, companions of the holy company of unbodied souls and immortal angels, turning themselves Proteus-like into any shape, and having the power of working miracles. The most pious and abstracted brethren could slack the plague in cities, silence the violent winds and tempests, calm the rage of the sea and rivers, walk in the air, frustrate the malicious aspect of witches, cure all diseases, and turn all metals into gold. He had known in his time two famous brethren of the Rosy Cross, named Walford and Williams, who had worked miracles in his sight, and taught him many excellent predictions of astrology and earthquakes. I desired one of these to tell me, says he, whether my complexion were capable of the society of my good genius. When I see you again, said he, I will tell you. When I saw him afterwards, he said, you should pray to God. For a good and holy man can offer no greater or more acceptable service to God than the oblation of himself, his soul. He said also that the good genii were the benign eyes of God, running to and fro in the world, and with love and pity beholding the innocent endeavors of harmless and single-hearted men, ever ready to do them good and to help them. Hayden held devoutly true that dogma of the Rosicrucians, which said that neither eating nor drinking was necessary to men. He maintained that anyone might exist in the same manner as that singular people dwelling near the source of the Ganges, of whom mention was made in the travels of his namesake, Sir Christopher Hayden, who had no mouths and therefore could not eat, but lived by the breath of their nostrils, except when they took a far journey, and then they mended their diet with the smell of flowers. He said that in really pure air there was a fine foreign fatness, with which it was sprinkled by the sunbeams, and which was quite sufficient for the nourishment of the generality of mankind. Those who had enormous appetites he had no objection to see take animal food, since they could not do without it. But he obstinately insisted that there was no necessity why they should eat it. If they put a plaster of nicely cooked meat upon their epigastrium, it would be sufficient for the wants of the most robust and voracious. They would by that means let in no diseases as they did at the broad and common gate, the mouth as anyone might see by example of drink. For all the while a man sat in water, he was never athirst. He had known, he said, many Rosicrucians, who by applying wine in this manner had fasted for years together. In fact, quoth Hayden, we may easily fast all our life, though it be 300 years without any kind of meat, and so cut off all danger of disease. This sage philosopher further informed his wondering contemporaries that the chiefs of the doctrine always carried about with them to their place of meeting their symbol, called the RC, which was an ebony cross, flourished and decked with roses of gold. The cross typifying Christ's sufferings upon the cross for our sins, and the roses of gold the glory and beauty of his resurrection. This symbol was carried alternately to Mecca, Mount Calvary, Mount Sinai, Haran, and to 3 other places which must have been in mid-air, called Castle, Apamia, and Charlatan Virisa Kunuk, where the Rosicrucian brethren met when they pleased, and made resolution of all their actions. They always took their pleasures in one of these places, where they resolved all questions of whatsoever had been done, was done, or should be done in the world, from the beginning to the end thereof. And these, he concludes, are the men called Rosicrucians. Towards the end of the 17th century, more rational ideas took possession of the sect, which still continued to boast of a few members. They appear to have considered that contentment was the true philosopher's stone, and to have abandoned the insane search for a mere phantom of the imagination. Addison, in The Spectator, gives an account of his conversation with a Rosicrucian, from which it may be inferred that the sect had grown wiser in their deeds, though in their talk they were as foolish as ever. I was once, says he, engaged in discourse with a Rosicrucian about the great secret. He talked of the secret as of a spirit which lived within an emerald, and converted everything that was near it to the highest perfection that it was capable of. It gives a luster, says he, to the sun, and water to the diamond. It irradiates every metal and enriches lead with all the properties of gold. It heightens smoke into flame, flame into light, and light into glory. He further added that a single ray of it dissipates pain and care and melancholy from the person on whom it falls. In short, says he, its presence naturally changes every place into a kind of heaven. After he had gone on for some time in this unintelligible cant, I found that he jumbled natural and moral ideas together into the same discourse, and that his great secret was nothing else but content. It is now time to speak of Jacob Boehme, who thought he could discover the secret of the transmutation of metals in the Bible, and who invented a strange heterogeneous doctrine of mingled alchemy and religion, and founded upon it the sect of the Rosicrucians. He was born at Görlitz in Upper Lusatia in 1575, and followed until his 30th year the occupation of a shoemaker. In this obscurity he remained with the character of a visionary and a man of unsettled mind, until the promulgation of the Rosicrucian philosophy in his part of Germany, toward the year 1607 or 1608. From that time he began to neglect his leather and buried his brain under the rubbish of metaphysics. The works of Paracelsus fell into his hands, and these, with the reveries of the Rosicrucians, so completely engrossed his attention that he abandoned his trade altogether. sinking at the same time from a state of comparative independence into poverty and destitution. But he was nothing daunted by the miseries and privations of the flesh. His mind was fixed upon the beings of another sphere, and in thought he was already the new apostle of the human race. In the year 1612, after a meditation of 4 years, he published his first work, entitled Aurora, or The Rising of the Sun, embodying the ridiculous notions of Paracelsus, and worse, confounding the confusion of that writer. The philosopher's stone might, he contended, be discovered by a diligent search of the Old and New Testaments, and more especially of the Apocalypse, which alone contained all the secrets of alchemy. He contended that the divine grace operated by the same rules and followed the same methods, that the divine providence observed in the natural world, and that the minds of men were purged from their vices and corruptions in the very same manner that metals were purified from their dross, namely, by fire. Besides the sylphs, gnomes, undines, and salamanders, he acknowledged various ranks and orders of demons. He pretended to invisibility and absolute chastity. He also said that, if it pleased him, he could abstain for years from meat and drink, and all the necessities of the body. It is needless, however, to pursue his follies any further. He was reprimanded for writing this work by the magistrates of Görlitz, and commanded to leave the pen alone and stick to his wax, that his family might not become chargeable to the parish. He neglected this good advice and continued his studies, burning minerals and purifying metals one day, and mystifying the word of God on the next. He afterwards wrote 3 other works as sublimely ridiculous as the first. The one was entitled Metallurgia, and has the slight merit of being the least obscure of his compositions. Another was called The Temporal Mirror of Eternity, and the last his Theosophy revealed, full of allegories and metaphors, all strange and Gießen, devoid of sense and ordinary reason. Böhmen died in 1624, leaving behind him a considerable number of admiring disciples. Many of them became, during the 17th century, as distinguished for absurdity as their master, amongst whom may be mentioned Giftheil, Vendenhagen, John Jacob Zimmermann, and Abraham Frankenberg. Their heresy rendered them obnoxious to the Church of Rome, and many of them suffered long imprisonment and torture for their faith. One, named Kuhlmann, was burned alive at Moscow in 1684 on a charge of sorcery. Böhmen's works were translated into English and published, many years afterwards, by an enthusiast named William Law. Peter Mormius, a notorious alchemist and contemporary of Böhmen, endeavored in 1630 to introduce the Rosicrucian philosophy into Holland. He applied to the States General to grant him a public audience, that he might explain the tenets of the sect and disclose a plan for rendering Holland the happiest and richest country on the earth, by means of the philosopher's stone and the service of the elementary spirits. The States General wisely resolved to have nothing to do with him. He thereupon determined to shame them by printing his book, which he did at Leyden the same year. It was entitled The Book of the Most Hidden Secrets of Nature, and was divided into 3 parts. The first treating of perpetual motion, the second of the transmutation of metals, and the third of the universal medicine. He also published some German works upon the Rosicrucian philosophy at Frankfurt in 1617. Poetry and romance are deeply indebted to the Rosicrucians for many a graceful creation. The literature of England, France, and Germany contains hundreds of sweet fictions, whose machinery has been borrowed from their daydreams. The delicate Ariel of Shakespeare stands preeminent among the number. From the same source, Pope drew the airy tenants of Belinda's dressing room in his charming Rape of the Lock, and La Motte Fouquet, the beautiful and capricious water nymph Undine, around whom he has thrown more grace and loveliness, and for whose imaginary woes he has excited more sympathy than ever were bestowed on a supernatural being. Sir Walter Scott also endowed the White Lady of Avenel with many of the attributes of the undines or water sprites. German romance and lyrical poetry teem with allusions to sylphs, gnomes, undines, and salamanders, and the French have not been behind in substituting them, in works of fiction, for the more cumbrous mythology of Greece and Rome. The sylphs, more especially, have been the favorites of the bards, and have become so familiar to the popular mind as to be in a manner confounded with that other race of ideal beings, the fairies, who can boast of an antiquity much more venerable in the annals of superstition. Having these obligations to the Rosicrucians, no lover of poetry can wish, however absurd they were, that such a sect of philosophers had never existed. Just at the time that Michael Mayer was making known to the world the existence of such a body as the Rosicrucians, There was born in Italy a man who was afterwards destined to become the most conspicuous member of the fraternity. The alchemic mania never called forth the ingenuity of a more consummate or more successful impostor than Joseph Francis Borri. He was born in 1616, according to some authorities, and in 1627, according to others, at Milan, where his father, the Signor Brandabori, practiced as a physician. At the age of 16, Joseph was sent to finish his education at the Jesuits' college in Rome, where he distinguished himself by his extraordinary memory. He learned everything to which he applied himself with the utmost ease. In the most voluminous works, no fact was too minute for his retention, and no study was so abstruse but that he could master it. But any advantages he might have derived from this facility were neutralized by his ungovernable passions and his love of turmoil and debauchery. He was involved in continual difficulty, as well with the heads of the college as with the police of Rome, and acquired so bad a character that years could not remove it. By the aid of his friends, he established himself as a physician in Rome, and also obtained some situation in the Pope's household. In one of his fits of studiousness, he grew enamored of alchemy, and determined to devote his energies to the discovery of the philosopher's stone. Of unfortunate propensities, he had quite sufficient besides this to bring him to poverty. His pleasures were as expensive as his studies, and both were of a nature to destroy his health and ruin his fair fame. At the age of 37, he found that he could not live by the practice of medicine, and began to look about for some other employment. He became in 1653 private secretary to the Marquis di Mirogli, the minister of the Archduke of Innsbruck at the court of Rome. He continued in this capacity for 2 years, leading, however, the same abandoned life as heretofore, frequenting the society of gamesters, debauchees, and loose women, involving himself in disgraceful street quarrels, and alienating the patrons who were desirous to befriend him. All at once a sudden change was observed in his conduct. The abandoned rake put on the outward sedateness of a philosopher. The scoffing sinner proclaimed that he had forsaken his evil ways, and would live thenceforth a model of virtue. To his friends this reformation was as pleasing as it was unexpected, and Borri gave obscure hints that it had been brought about by some miraculous manifestation of a superior power. He pretended that he held converse with beneficent spirits, that the secrets of God and nature were revealed to him, and that he had obtained possession of the philosopher's stone. Like his predecessor Jakob Böhmen, he mixed up religious questions with his philosophical jargon, and took measures for declaring himself the founder of a new sect. This, at Rome itself and in the very palace of the Pope, was a hazardous proceeding, and Borri just awoke to a sense of it in time to save himself from the dungeons of the castle of St. Angelo. He fled to Innsbruck, where he remained about a year and then returned to his native city of Milan. The reputation of his great sanctity had gone before him, and he found many persons ready to attach themselves to his fortunes. All who were desirous of entering into the new communion took an oath of poverty and relinquished their possessions for the general good of the fraternity. Borri told them that he had received from the archangel Michael a heavenly sword, upon the hilt of which were engraven the names of the 7 celestial intelligences. "Whoever shall refuse," said he, "to enter into my new sheepfold shall be destroyed by the papal armies, of whom God has predestined me to be the chief. To those who follow me all joy shall be granted. I shall soon bring my chemical studies to a happy conclusion by the discovery of the philosopher's stone, and by this means we shall all have as much gold as we desire. I am assured of the aid of the angelic hosts, and more especially of the archangel Michael's. When I began to walk in the way of the Spirit, I had a vision of the night, and was assured by an angelic voice that I should become a prophet. In sign of it I saw a palm tree surrounded with all the glory of paradise. The angels come to me whenever I call, and reveal to me all the secrets of the universe. The sylphs and elementary spirits obey me and fly to the uttermost ends of the world to serve me, and those whom I delight to honor." By force of continually repeating such stories as these, Borri soon found himself at the head of a very considerable number of adherents. As he figures in these pages as an alchemist and not as a religious sectarian, it will be unnecessary to repeat the doctrines which he taught with regard to some of the dogmas of the Church of Rome, and which exposed him to the fierce resentment of the papal authority. They were to the full as ridiculous as his philosophical pretensions. As the number of his followers increased, he appears to have cherished the idea of becoming one day a new Mahomet, and of founding, in his native city of Milan, a monarchy and religion of which he should be the king and the prophet. He had taken measures in the year 1658 for seizing the guards at all the gates of that city, and formally declaring himself the monarch of the Milanese. Just as he thought the plan ripe for execution, it was discovered. 20 of his followers were arrested, and he himself managed, with the utmost difficulty, to escape to the neutral territory of Switzerland, where the papal displeasure could not reach him. The trial of his followers commenced forthwith, and the whole of them were sentenced to various terms of imprisonment. Borri's trial proceeded in his absence and lasted for upwards of 2 years. He was condemned to death as a heretic and sorcerer in 1661 and was burned in effigy in Rome by the common hangman. Borri, in the meantime, lived quietly in Switzerland, indulging himself in railing at the Inquisition and its proceedings. He afterwards went to Strasbourg, intending to fix his residence in that town. He was received with great cordiality as a man persecuted for his religious opinions, and withal a great alchemist. He found that sphere too narrow for his aspiring genius, and retired in the same year to the more wealthy city of Amsterdam. He there hired a magnificent house, established an equipage which eclipsed in brilliancy those of the richest merchants, and assumed the title of Excellency. Where he got the money to live in this expensive style was long a secret. The adepts in alchemy easily explained it, after their fashion. Sensible people were of opinion that he had come by it in a less wonderful manner, for it was remembered that among his unfortunate disciples in Milan there were many rich men, who, in conformity with one of the fundamental rules of the sect, had given up all their earthly wealth into the hands of their founder. In whatever manner the money was obtained, Borri spent it in Holland with an unsparing hand, and was looked up to by the people with no little respect and veneration. He performed several able cures and increased his reputation so much that he was vaunted as a prodigy. He continued diligently the operations of alchemy, and was in daily expectation that he should succeed in turning the inferior metals into gold. This hope never abandoned him, even in the worst extremity of his fortunes, and in his prosperity it led him into the most foolish expenses. But he could not long continue to live so magnificently upon the funds he had brought from Italy, and the philosopher's stone, though it promised all for the wants of the morrow, never brought anything for the necessities of today. He was obliged in a few months to retrench by giving up his large house, his gilded coach and valuable blood horses, his liveried domestics, and his luxurious entertainments. With this diminution of splendor came a diminution of renown. His cures did not appear so miraculous when he went out on foot to perform them, as they had seemed when His Excellency had driven to a poor man's door in his carriage with 6 horses. He sank from a prodigy into an ordinary man. His great friends showed him the cold shoulder, and his humble flatterers carried their incense to some other shrine. Borri now thought it high time to change his quarters. With this view he borrowed money wherever he could get it, and succeeded in obtaining 200,000 florins from a merchant named Demir, to aid, as he said, in discovering the water of life. He also obtained 6 diamonds of great value, on pretense that he could remove the flaws from them without diminishing their weight. With this booty he stole away secretly by night, and proceeded to Hamburg. On his arrival in that city he found the celebrated Christina, the ex-queen of Sweden. He procured an introduction to her, and requested her patronage in his endeavor to discover the philosopher's stone. She gave him some encouragement, but Borri, fearing that the merchants of Amsterdam, who had connections in Hamburg, might expose his delinquencies if he remained in the latter city, passed over to Copenhagen and sought the protection of Frederick III, the King of Denmark. This prince was a firm believer in the transmutation of metals. Being in want of money, he readily listened to the plans of an adventurer who had both eloquence and ability to recommend him. He provided Borri with the means to make experiments, and took a great interest in the progress of his operations. He expected every month to possess riches that would buy Peru, and when he was disappointed, accepted patiently the excuses of Borri, who, upon every failure, was always ready with some plausible explanation. He became in time much attached to him, and defended him from the jealous attacks of his courtiers, and the indignation of those who were grieved to see their monarch the easy dupe of a charlatan. Borri endeavored by every means in his power to find aliment for this good opinion. His knowledge of medicine was useful to him in this respect, and often stood between him and disgrace. He lived 6 years in this manner at the court of Frederick, but that monarch dying in 1670 he was left without a protector. As he had made more enemies than friends in Copenhagen, and had nothing to hope from the succeeding sovereign, he sought an asylum in another country. He went first to Saxony, but met so little encouragement and encountered so much danger from the emissaries of the Inquisition that he did not remain there many months. Anticipating nothing but persecution in every country that acknowledged the spiritual authority of the Pope, He appears to have taken the resolution to dwell in Turkey and turn Mussulman. On his arrival at the Hungarian frontier, on his way to Constantinople, he was arrested on suspicion of being concerned in the conspiracy of the Counts Nadasdi and Frangipani, which had just been discovered. In vain he protested his innocence and divulged his real name and profession. He was detained in prison, and a letter dispatched to the Emperor Leopold to know what should be done with him. The star of his fortunes was on the decline. The letter reached Leopold at an unlucky moment. The Pope's nuncio was closeted with His Majesty, and he no sooner heard the name of Joseph Francis Borri than he demanded him as a prisoner of the Holy See. The request was complied with, and Borri, closely manacled, was sent under an escort of soldiers to the prison of the Inquisition at Rome. He was too much of an impostor to be deeply tinged with fanaticism, and was not unwilling to make a public recantation of his heresies if he could thereby save his life. When the proposition was made to him, he accepted it with eagerness. His punishment was to be commuted into the hardly less severe one of perpetual imprisonment. But he was too happy to escape the clutch of the executioner at any price, and he made the amende honorable in face of the assembled multitudes of Rome on the 27th of October, 1672. He was then transferred to the prisons of the castle of St. Angelo, where he remained till his death, 23 years afterwards. It is said that towards the close of his life, considerable indulgence was granted him, that he was allowed to have a laboratory and to cheer the solitude of his dungeon by searching for the philosopher's stone. Queen Christina, during her residence at Rome, frequently visited the old man to converse with him upon chemistry and the doctrines of the Rosicrucians. She even obtained permission that he should leave his prison occasionally for a day or two and reside in her palace, she being responsible for his return to captivity. She encouraged him to search for the great secret of the alchemists and provided him with money for the purpose. It may well be supposed that Borri benefited most by this acquaintance, and that Christina got nothing but experience. It is not sure that she gained even that, for until her dying day she was convinced of the possibility of finding the philosopher's stone, and ready to assist any adventurer either zealous or impudent enough to pretend to it. After Borri had been about 11 years in confinement, a small volume was published at Cologne, entitled The Key of the Cabinet of the Chevalier Joseph Francis Borri, in which are contained many curious letters upon chemistry and other sciences, written by him, together with a memoir of his life. This book contained a complete exposition of the Rosicrucian philosophy, and afforded materials to the Abbé de Villars for his interesting Count de Gabalis, which excited so much attention at the close of the 17th century. Borri lingered in the prison of St. Angelo till 1695 when he died, in his 80th year. Besides the Key of the Cabinet, written originally in Copenhagen in 1666 for the edification of King Frederick III, he published a work upon alchemy and the secret sciences under the title of The Mission of Romulus to the Romans. Besides the pretenders to the philosopher's stone whose lives have been already narrated, this and the preceding century produced a great number of writers who inundated literature with their books upon the subject. In fact, most of the learned men of that age had some faith in it. Van Helmont, Borrichius, Kircher, Boerhaave, and a score of others, though not professed alchemists, were fond of the science, and countenanced its professors. Helvetius, the grandfather of the celebrated philosopher of the same name, asserts that he saw an inferior metal turned into gold by a stranger at The Hague in 1666. He says that, sitting one day in his study, a man who was dressed as a respectable burgher of North Holland and very modest and simple in his appearance, called upon him with the intention of dispelling his doubts relative to the philosopher's stone. He asked Helvetius if he thought he should know that rare gem if he saw it, to which Helvetius replied that he certainly should not. The burgher immediately drew from his pocket a small ivory box, containing 3 pieces of metal of the color of brimstone and extremely heavy, and assured Helvetius that of them he could make as much as 20 tons of gold. Helvetius informs us that he examined them very attentively, and seeing that they were very brittle, he took the opportunity to scrape off a small portion with his thumbnail. He then returned them to the stranger with an entreaty that he would perform the process of transmutation before him. The stranger replied that he was not allowed to do so, and went away. After his departure, Helvetius procured a crucible and a portion of lead, into which, when in a state of fusion, he threw the stolen grain from the philosopher's stone. He was disappointed to find that the grain evaporated altogether, leaving the lead in its original state. Some weeks afterwards, when he had almost forgotten the subject, he received another visit from the stranger. He again entreated him to explain the processes by which he pretended to transmute lead. The stranger at last consented and informed him that 1 grain was sufficient, but that it was necessary to envelope it in a ball of wax before throwing it on the molten metal. Otherwise, its extreme volatility would cause it to go off in vapor. They tried the experiment and succeeded to their heart's content. Helvetius repeated the experiment alone and converted 6 ounces of lead into very pure gold. The fame of this event spread all over The Hague, and all the notable persons of the town flocked to the study of Helvetius to convince themselves of the fact. Helvetius performed the experiment again in the presence of the Prince of Orange and several times afterwards, until he exhausted the whole of the powder he had received from the stranger, from whom it is necessary to state he never received another visit, nor did he ever discover his name or condition. In the following year, Helvetius published his Golden Calf, in which he detailed the above circumstances. About the same time, the celebrated Father Kircher published his Subterranean World, in which he called the alchemists a congregation of knaves and impostors, and their science a delusion. He admitted that he had himself been a diligent laborer in the field, and had only come to this conclusion after mature consideration and repeated fruitless experiments. All the alchemists were in arms immediately to refute this formidable antagonist. One Solomon de Blauenstein was the first to grapple with him, and attempted to convict him of willful misrepresentation by recalling to his memory the transmutations by Sendivogius before the Emperor Frederick III, and the Elector of Mayence, all performed within a recent period. Swelfer and Glauber also entered into the dispute, and attributed the enmity of Father Kircher to spite and jealousy against adepts who had been more successful than himself. It was also pretended that Gustavus Adolphus transmuted a quantity of quicksilver into pure gold. The learned Borricius relates that he saw coins which had been struck of this gold, and Lenglet du Fresnoy deposes to the same circumstance. In the Travels of Monconis, the story is told in the following manner. A merchant of Lubeck, who carried on but little trade, but who knew how to change lead into very good gold, gave the king of Sweden a lingot which he had made, weighing at least 100 pounds. The king immediately caused it to be coined into ducats, and because he knew positively that its origin was such as had been stated to him, he had his own arms graven upon the one side, and emblematical figures of Mercury and Venus on the other. I have one of these ducats in my possession, and was credibly informed that after the death of the Lubeck merchant, who had never appeared very rich, a sum of no less than 1,700,000 crowns was found in his coffers. Such stories as these, confidently related by men high in station, tended to keep up the infatuation of the alchemists in every country of Europe. Thank you for watching until the end. If you want to go deep down into the rabbit hole of marketing and persuasion, click the link in the description where you will find many fundamental books about copywriting, psychology, and persuasion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one. See you in the next one.